You may not have had this conversation yet. You may have had this conversation. Chances are, if you care about your faith and talk to people who are not Christians, you will have a conversation that goes something like this. Maybe when you're at college, you're sitting in the quad, you're sipping on a water, and you're talking with a good friend who he's kind of into philosophy or something like that. So you're talking about bigger things, and it kind of comes out that you're a Christian, and he starts to kind of say, well, how can you be a Christian? You're smart. I know you. You think and you go to class, and Christians, they're not very smart. They're dumb people. You say, well, wait a minute, how is that? He says, well, because Jesus, he wasn't even a real person. He was somebody who the monks in the Middle Ages made up because the Pope, he wanted to have power over the people. And in order to do that, he had to give them a God that they would believe in. So he created this mythology about a guy named Jesus who really is probably just an Egyptian god who's been twisted a little bit and turned him into God and convinced you to believe that. So how can you believe that today? And if you're not ready for that conversation, if you've never heard that there are people out there that believe that, if you've never been surfing the History Channel late at night and you've seen some guy with the name Pastor right in front of his name who says Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it's all made up, it was just a spiritual resurrection, well then what are you going to do when you run into that the first time? Are you armed and prepared to counter that argument with something more than, well, I believe in Jesus because of faith? You just have to believe. Because as soon as you go down that route, they're going to go the route of, oh, you have faith. That means you're stupid, right? I have science. I'm smart. I use facts. I use logic. You use faith. And you end up in this situation where you're outwitted and outmanned because you have no actual answers. When the reality is that Christianity is one of the most factually, not one of the most, the most factually based religion, philosophy on the planet. And the facts of who Jesus actually was are definitely on our side if we're in any conversation about what the real history of the matter was. And that's what I'm going to try to give you today. I'm going to try to show you both from some inside the Bible, but also from some outside the Bible, information from historical sources about who Jesus is, what he did, that leads you to, I think, if you're logical, have to accept the best explanation for all that we know is that Jesus Christ is a man who rose from the dead. Now, this won't necessarily convince somebody who doesn't want to believe this of the facts, of the explanation of the facts. But if somebody is an honest person, if they're willing to let the facts stand on their own and not a priori, that word's going to come up again. It's a Latin phrase that means before you've even talked. A priori decide Jesus didn't rise from the dead, so that can't be the answer to the facts. If you have somebody who isn't on that boat, when they spend time with these facts, they come to the conclusion, you have to, that the best explanation of what we know about Jesus is that he rose from the dead. I'm going to try to show that to you here today. But to do that, you're going to need a little bit of a brain shift. We modern people got some problems. You're going to need to forget all you think you know about how you know things. And this is a fancy philosophical idea called epistemology. Now you all just went to sleep as soon as I said that, right? Yeah? How you know things. The guy who says, I have science, you have faith, he thinks he knows things only because he's seen them. And this is a very American phenomenon. It's not true unless I've personally experienced it. And when we're talking about religion, that's how we judge religion. It's only true if I personally experience it. The atheist says, God's not true because I've never seen him. I've seen no proof of him, so he can't be there, right? So it's all about my own perspective. But when it comes to the way you live the rest of your life, nobody lives like this, right? How do you know the world is round? Is there anybody here who thinks it's not? Yeah? No, we all think it's round, right? Why? Because somebody told you. Well, proven by who and how? By science. Well, who was the science proven by? A scientist who studied it. He saw some evidence, and he said the result of this evidence is this. He gave an eyewitness account of something that somebody else just took on faith. Right? Why? Because the source was trustworthy. So the issue is not whether or not you ever take information on faith. You take information on faith all the time. Man, I just remember like 5 years ago, soybeans were good for you. Man, now they're bad for you. Well, which one is it? What does science really say? You have to go back and study it. You have to test it, get actual facts, and then people who study those facts write about them. That's called a witness. And then you put that information together and you build a worldview out of that, or you build a way of understanding or thinking. Everything you know comes from what somebody else told you. How do you know the sky is blue? They told you it's blue. Look, there it is. That's blue. Well, that could have been green. We just got it wrong. Right? How do you know? Because eyewitness testimony is trustworthy, and that's the point here. You can trust trustworthy witnesses. Does that mean all witnesses are trustworthy? No. You have to test them. So when we're going to ask questions about Jesus and who he was and what he did, we have to find out, are the sources that we have trustworthy? And there's a way to do that. And we have to find out then, what do those facts of those eyewitnesses come together to mean? All right, I just got lost. Yeah. So we got to get out of this precision time reality where I expect everything to be given to me like a newspaper would give it, as if all knowledge comes in that way, and realize that as soon as you go past the invention of the radio and the television, all knowledge comes from nothing but written eyewitness accounts. Some guy somewhere saw something, wrote it down. We have that piece of paper. Does that mean it's true? No. But it means at least he thinks he saw it, or he has a motive for saying he thinks he saw it. And you have to explain all the pieces of paper you find throughout archaeology with those limitations. And one of the biggest challenges then for the information I'm going to show you about who Jesus is, according to the historical documents, is if they're not telling the truth, why? You can't just say, I don't believe it. Not if you're a historian, not if you believe in facts. You have to be able to say why they're lying. What is their agenda? What is their motive? And then when you're doing that, if I'm in a courtroom, and you kind of got to imagine that you are in a courtroom here, and you're building a case for the judge to make a decision on, and you're bringing in witnesses. If I bring in one witness, and he's the best friend of the guy who did it, that isn't necessarily going to be a strong case if he tries to get the guy off, right? He's got a motive to get his friend off. But if I bring in the guy's worst enemy, and he's got information that gets the guy off, now I've got a little bit of a better case. He has no motive to lie. In fact, he has a motive to not say what he's about to say. And if I bring in 50 witnesses who all saw the exact same thing, I have a better case than if I bring in just one witness who saw it by themselves. So this is the kind of stuff you have to apply to this information I'm going to show you. I can't show you the risen body of Jesus to prove he's resurrected from the dead. I don't have that. Well, this is my body, but it doesn't look like it, right? So that doesn't count in this sense. I can't give you that kind of thing. There's no pictures. This is before that time happened. So you have to look at it as a historian, and there's a whole science to this. This is how we know everything about history. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. We're going to get back to this. But how do you know George Washington crossed the Delaware River? How do you know Julius Caesar was the emperor of Rome? Because somebody somewhere wrote it down. And we have enough, in theory, witnesses to believe that what they said is at least mostly true. If we apply that thinking to what we know about Jesus of Nazareth, it's astounding what we know. Astounding. So, we have to get away from our prejudice toward progressivism, thinking we're smarter, we just know better. These ancient people were stupid, they didn't know how to write. That's not true at all. We have to get biased against... that's wrong. We have to be biased for logic. That's why I slipped around. Today we are biased against logic and biased toward emotion. I'll try to prove this to you right now. So the skeptic or the atheist, if they get into a real discussion with you, an argument about religion, you can think of maybe even a guy like Bill Nye, if you know who he is, when he does his videos. He doesn't argue with logic. He argues with his emotions. And he does it like this. He says, I have logic on my side and you don't. That's not a fact. That's not an argument. He just used an emotional push to try to convince you he had logic. But he didn't actually use the logic, right? How can you not believe in evolution? Dinosaurs! He said that literally. Right? That's not an argument. It's an emotional push. And we as a culture, because of our television watching, I'm not against that, but it's a fact, we are biased toward emotional arguments rather than the facts. So you have to kind of pull yourself out of that a little bit, and then you can't have a priori thinking. You can't decide, I know the answer to all the results before I look at the facts. You can't do that as a historian. You can't do that in a courtroom. The judge can't go in already knowing who did it. It would not be a trial at that point. Let's skip that. So, everything you know because somebody saw it and said so. So you got witnesses, and then you got reliable witnesses. And one of the questions then is going to be, is this main witness of Christianity, the New Testament, a reliable witness? And now I'm not talking about is it the inspired and inerrant Word of God? I'm not talking about, does it give us absolute truth? I'm talking about, do the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Matthew reliably tell you what Matthew and Paul thought? Is it a witness to what they think, at least? Because some people would say the book fell out of the sky in the 800s, or the book fell out of the sky right away, like in the early church, but it's not connected to the apostles. Or in the 800s, they took the book and they changed it, and it's all entirely different now. Well, that would negate our willingness to trust this thing. If you found a letter that said, I saw Bob murder Jean, but it was 2,000 years ago, but the letter was written on type-printed paper with a laser jet, you'd question whether it was really a good witness, because it couldn't have been written when it says it was, right? So, is the New Testament reliable in this way? This is our first set of facts here, and the thing is, it is a tremendously reliable witness, better than almost anything in the ancient world. There is nothing in the ancient world more reliable as a witness than the documents of the New Testament. I'll try to show you why. One reason is numbers, copies. Think about again, if you have 50 witnesses versus one witness, you have a better case. So if I have 5,000 copies of something, all from a time period when it says it was written, that is more reliable than 20 copies of something, all from 800 years after when it said it was written, right? That's one thing we have to apply, this kind of thing. I'm going to show you the numbers in a moment. Better dates, like I just said, closer to when it actually happened. If you have it written down within 100 years, it's within a generation. That means somebody who's writing it down and publishing it can be challenged by somebody else who also saw the event and says, no, he's lying. 800 years later, who can call you a liar, right? You can just say it, right? And then the other one is, are parts of it lost? Many documents that we have, I think some of these are going to say reconstructed as we look at them. They're reconstructed because we lost parts of them. So we've had to take them and make them out of quotes from other people. Right? So I'm Bob, I'm writing a book, I quote John, and I have this big chunk of his quote, but nobody can find John's book. But like 15 people quoted John, so we can take all the pieces of John's quotes and put them together and say, there's the works of John. Right? But parts were lost, so it's less reliable. The New Testament wins on every single one of these things. It's really quite unbelievable. This picture is not big enough. I wish it was. This is the number of copies of New Testament documents and fragments versus those of ancient world documents. You may have heard of Homer. He's one of the better ones. We have more of him. Versus Aristotle, or let's see, Plato down here. We have 7 copies of Plato. Versus 24,000 pieces of the New Testament. It's not all full copies, right? You got fragments, but 24,000 pieces. That's a lot of witnesses, right? That's a lot of copies to try to find out how reliable the text is. We go down a little further. This document will show same kind of information, just shown differently. This is the date that it is, let me get this right here. This is the date he's supposed to have written. This is when the earliest copy comes from. This is the difference. How long between the time it supposedly happened and the time we have a document from. This is the number of copies. So, Homer. I don't know why the numbers aren't there for Homer, so we'll skip Homer. Plato. Here we go. Plato, who, if you don't know who Plato is, he's like the most famous philosopher of the ancient world. Like you got to know that name. It's not like playing with the stuff and squishing it, right? He's a guy who taught that there is 2 kinds of worlds, spiritual and physical. We all believe this as Americans. The soul and the body. And that the soul, the spiritual, is the more authentic, the more real place. And the body is just kind of what we have to deal with. We all actually think like Plato as Americans. It's quite amazing and scary because it's a bit anti-Christian. But anyway, he wrote around 380 BC, and the earliest copies of his documents, which there's only 7, we have 1,300 years later. So, was Plato really Plato? Or was it some other guy? Or is it a bunch of stuff that was made up in the middle? Right? I don't know, maybe. The truthworthiness of his ideas is one thing, but knowing who he was, yet we all just assume that Plato exists. If you go into philosophy class, no one will question it, was Plato real? Right? Everyone assumes he was there. Well, let's try to extend this charity. I mean, we got Caesar here, 60 BC. His documents come from 8900. But everyone assumes Caesar wrote Caesar's documents. We trust it, even though it's a reconstruction. The New Testament, from AD 60 with the documents, the earliest copies coming from AD 130, within 100 years. Barely 2 generations there. with 14,000, now this must be a different kind of copies. This must be copies of the actual full New Testament. So that we can know with 99.5% accuracy that the New Testament Greek your pastor uses is what was written by the hand of the guy who wrote it. Now this doesn't prove it's true and from God, right? This just proves the guy wrote it. And this is important. So the guy who says the Bible was just made up in the 400s by some monks who twisted it, which Islam also says, by the way, they just aren't looking at history. They're making stuff up and calling it true, right? And they'll use an emotional argument to try to win. And you as a Christian want to have in your back pocket, no, you made that up. But we actually have copies from before when you said this happened. By normal historical standards, the New Testament is I'm being weak here, a good witness. It is a phenomenal witness. It is mind-bogglingly good. History doesn't do this, and yet it did. Why? Well, because people cared about it, right? So they made lots of copies. But still, it's quite amazing. Now we're going to shift gears here. We'll come back to some about the New Testament. But what I want to move into now is trying to establish what we can know from history from all the witnesses, both New Testament and outside of the Bible witnesses, about this man Jesus. Because again, in the last 2 years I've had this happen where I ran into someone online who said Jesus wasn't even real. Jesus wasn't real? Well, I have logic. You have faith. Whoa. Let's define how we're going to make this argument. Is logic based on facts? Yes. Well, then I'm not making a faith argument when I say Jesus was a real man. I'm just basing it on historical evidence, historical documents. I have a faith argument when I say that his resurrection from the dead forgives me of my sins. Okay, now we're in the world of faith where I'm basing it on trust in what Jesus said to be true. When I say he's a real man, this is just a fact. And we know this not just from the New Testament. We know this from many other writers. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes, but this statement right here is about as important as it gets. That non-biblical mentions of Jesus as a real historical figure happens more than any other event in history. Nothing else in history outside the Bible is recorded as often as the existence of Jesus. So the guy who says Jesus didn't exist, he's at least got to prove that all these mentions are wrong, and that means he's got to give motives for all these people to lie about what they're saying. Right? Otherwise, he's not basing his argument on facts. He's just making stuff up. So Suetonius, a non-Christian, writing in 80 to 120, we don't know exactly when, but a late early church era, in writing about the reign of Claudius Caesar, one of the Caesars during the Christian early church lifetime, and how Caesar had to deal with these riots in Rome connected to Judaism and possibly connected to Christianity as well. Here's what he writes. He writes, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, that's Claudius, expelled him from the city. Now, if this was the only source we had for Jesus outside the New Testament, it would be pretty weak. But when you add this to all the rest that's going to come, it starts to build quite a case that there was a man named Chrestus, or Christ, I'll come back to why that's spelled differently in a moment, who existed sometime shortly before this, actually around this, right? That's super early, by the way. That's right on the money when you're talking about a witness. This is within a generation. We get a witness to the existence of Jesus as a man who has influenced some people in Rome that are connected to the Jews, and so there's a fight, and all they know is that the Jews are fighting amongst themselves about this guy named Christ, right? Within 100 years, Jesus existed. I mean, you really could prove it just from this. There's more than this. It's not that strong, but it's a great starting point. Why is Christ spelled differently? Because in Greek and Latin, you spell your name differently based on where it is in the sentence. So if you are at the beginning of the sentence, you're spelled one way. If you're at the end of the sentence, you're spelled a different way. And on top of that, not everybody cares about spelling the way we do. Newspapers changed how much we care about spelling. I know you probably don't, right? But your teachers do, right? And so that's a product of a newspaper print culture. Back in the ancient world, you spelled it however it sounded sometimes, and yet you changed it based on where it was in the sentence. So this is not a problem at all to say this is clearly a reference to Christ, the word Christ. Misunderstood even by this Roman guy who just didn't know who he was, but he'd heard the name Chrestus, right? So we have a reference to Jesus, the historical figure, and then on top of this, would you believe it, it corroborates the New Testament as a witness. Because the riots in Rome are mentioned in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, where it talks about Aquila and a Priscilla friends of Paul who fled Rome to escape the persecutions there. Huh? So it actually is affirming the New Testament witness, inadvertently. We'll talk about that in a moment. Hostile witnesses, they accidentally help you. We'll come back to that. Josephus. Now, Josephus you have to be a little careful with when you're arguing online, because whoever you're arguing with has probably run into the idea of Josephus before, and he's been told you can't trust anything Josephus wrote. It was totally messed with. It was tampered with, and so it's not worth even talking about. Well, that's the information from about 100 years ago, and that's 100 years ago. That's what scholars thought, and it was true that the original text that we're going to look at had certainly sometime in the Middle Ages been tampered with by somebody. Yeah? And so they'd added some things that the guy Josephus just never would have said. And it would have been impossible for him as a human being to give the confession he gave without being a Christian. And yet scholarship has continued to study all the different copies we have of Josephus. Again, he was a Jewish historian who worked for Caesar, and he wrote an entire history of the Jewish people on behalf of Caesar. And even more than that as well, but history from the Jewish perspective. They've continued to study him because he has a lot of other information about the ancient world in his works. And now they believe they can actually reconstruct what he really said. And that's what I'm going to show you. I'm not going to show you the original copy that we have that everyone thinks is wrong. I'm going to show you what the best scholars, not Christian scholars, the best scholars think he actually said. And so this is yet another witness. It's not the best witness. This is the guy, you're calling the guy onto the stand, and he comes in and he's kind of drunk as he comes in, right? And he sits on the stand. The judge is going to be like, how much can I trust this guy? But if you got all the other witnesses saying the same thing this guy says, it keeps helping the case, right? So, here's what he says in his Antiquities. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Remember, all we're trying to prove right now is Jesus was a real person, right? You can't prove Jesus existed. Well, now we have two ancient non-Christian sources that say that he did. So you're telling me he didn't exist? Tell me why they said what they said, or show me some documents from them that say it's a myth. But it was all made up. But there aren't any of those. Right? So why are you rejecting these? If they're logical, you're going to have to accept this much. That there was a guy called Jesus. He was a nice guy. Everyone liked him a little bit, right? Virtuous. And many people became his disciples. Not really that radical an idea. If you read this about any other figure in history, there was a man named Jimbo, and he sat on a rock. You'd kind of assume, well, yeah, there probably was a guy named Jimbo who sat on a rock, right? So why would you reject this unless you've a priori decided you don't want to believe there was a man named Jesus? And you're going to reject all the evidence. Which again is not logical. It's very irrational. Pliny the Younger, Roman governor of Bithynia, who persecuted Christianity by killing them, execution, due to the massive conversions that were emptying the pagan temples. So, he's charged to run an area. The economy's maybe not doing as well as it could because the temples that are used to make the economy run with all the sacrifices, they're empty because everyone's becoming a Christian. So he says, I got to get rid of Christianity. So what does he do? He starts killing them. And yet when he writes about Christians, he speaks very highly of us. It wasn't like he hated us. He needed us to stop doing what we were doing. Here's what he writes. They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. And this is real important here. Not to, he doesn't write, they sang a hymn to the God Christ. He's saying they sang a hymn to a man called Christ as if he were God. So he is inadvertently confessing the incarnation, that is the deity of Jesus Christ, the man, as a hostile witness. This is not our friend. He hates us. He doesn't hate us. He kills us. Yeah? Different than hate, I suppose. But he's telling that there was this man named Christ, who people thought was God. And they bound themselves by solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery. 10 Commandments show up. It's kind of nice. Never to falsify their word, nor to deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. He's actually talking about a rumor that was going on that Christians were cannibals, that they would get together and kill a son and eat him. Well, eat his flesh and his blood. You can kind of understand how a pagan might get it wrong, right? And so he's saying, no, they just eat bread and wine. Right? They get together and they do that. But what do you see? We're just trying to prove Jesus was a real human. You can't prove it outside the Bible. Yes, I can. In fact, everybody that mentions him as a real man, not as a myth. Right? There's going to be things they say are superstition, which when they tell us that people thought he rose from the dead, we'll get to that. But he was a real man. Very obvious. So the real question again for the skeptic is, are you going to let the facts speak and define what you know as history to be true? Or are you going to a priori, that is, just beforehand, on your own, assume, decide to reject his miracles and teaching? That's why I meant to cut that last night. To reject his existence, right? Miracles and teaching is a different thing. But to reject his existence. I would leave before the court. The case is closed. There was a man named Jesus. It's not that tough. Really isn't that tough to make the point, historically speaking. Fact number 2, we're going to add this now and keep building a bigger case toward this resurrection idea. There was this real human died by crucifixion and was buried. And this should not be here. Shh, ignore that part. That was above. But we do have a guy named Tacitus. Tacitus was the greatest historian of ancient Rome. Wrote a book called The Annals, in which he basically tried to cover all of history up to that point. He's very well respected. He was on that list of documents I showed earlier. And in terms of what we know about the ancient world, when you go and you study ancient history and they tell you this happened, this happened, this happened, like a lot of that's just Tacitus. We're just taking him at his word. Right? Well, here's what this guy, who's a really trustworthy source, says about Jesus. He says, Christus, notice the spelling's different again, from whom the name had its origin, that is, Christianity is named after this guy, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius Caesar at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. It's just what our creed says, right? He was crucified and buried. If you're going to say Tacitus is lying, you got to prove it. If you're going to say it was tampered with, you got to prove that too. Yeah? No one has said that. There are plenty of scholars who would like to say that. But that is not what scholarship says about this text. It's an authentic text to Tacitus. Jesus died. The real human died at the hands of the Romans. Crucifixion is the way they generally did it. Josephus also writes, again, now we got, the drunk guys here kind of saying, yeah, he's right, he saw it, I agree, right? But he's saying the same thing. At this time, we read this first part, there was a wise man called Jesus, the new part's here. Pilate condemned him to be crucified to die. Both witnesses to Pilate. This is a total aside here. I once heard a story about a very liberal Christian, a pastor, who said, I don't believe in the Apostles' Creed. And when he was asked why, he said, there's one line I can't believe. Which one? The resurrection? No, the resurrection's fine. Well, which one? Under Pontius Pilate, he said. Why? Because it meant that it was real history. He could believe in a resurrection that was an idea. Right? Something to hope in, that we all rise from the ashes of our troubles and mistakes. And the story of Jesus teaches us this, right? Harry Potter style. But he couldn't believe that Pontius Pilate was really the one who crucified Jesus. Yet we have 2 non-biblical sources that say he was. Thallus, writing in 52 AD in a history of the Mediterranean world, quoted by Julius Africanus in 221. So this is one of those situations where you have a missing book, right? We don't have Thallus. We have this other guy, Julius. But as he's writing his story, he says, and just as Thallus writes in book 3 of yada, 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 and then he quotes it. So he's quoting a book from somewhere. We just don't have the book anymore. But we know that it's there. Other people quote him as well, not necessarily this quote. Here's the quote, though, from Thallus. Again, and it's in 221 AD. Like, on that schedule of how far away it is from the events, 200 years is not far. That's like the Revolutionary War, right? It's not that far away from us in terms of did it really happen or not, or is it just made up? Yeah. Now, this is interesting too, what he actually writes. This historian writes, on the whole world, there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea, again he's writing a history of the Mediterranean world, many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, now we're having Julius saying, Thallus in the 3rd book of his history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So we have a recording from 50 AD, copied in 221 AD, about an eclipse in Judea that happened at midday and covered the land in darkness, so much so that it caused turmoil and upheaval. And the guy who's reading Thallus says, I don't think Thallus is telling the truth. I think Thallus is biased. This couldn't have been an eclipse. It had to be something more. That's all we have there, but it corroborates something the New Testament says, right? That as Jesus is hanging on the cross, darkness covers the land. The scientist says, how can you believe that? Well, I don't know. It's in more than one place. Right? It's testified to by the ancient witnesses. The Jewish Talmud Begun in 135 AD as a collection of the Jewish works after the destruction of their temple, completed in 200 AD. It says this: on the evening, that should say, of the Passover, Yeshu, that's Israel, that's Hebrew for Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua, Jesus was hanged. So right there, the Jews in 135, 200 AD say the real man, Jesus, was strung up on a tree. Right? There it is. Ancient history from the most hostile witness you can get. Everything the Jews write about Jesus, they mean it to undermine your belief in him. And yet here it remains them confessing a fact. He died. Yeah? The modern man must accept this if he believes in history being known at all. Now it also says, for 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. This is great too. It's not part of our argument. But what did they just admit Jesus did? Miracles. The Jews in 200 admit, yeah, everyone kind of knows that guy Jesus, he did magic. Or something. Yeah? Hostile witness helping us. Lucian, 2nd century Greek satirist, another hostile witness. This guy's a comedian. Satirists were comedians. So they're writing to make you laugh, trying to kind of say something witty and funny, right? And he's writing about Christians, how dumb we are. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. They worship a man, it's so funny. Yeah? They worship a man. There was a real man named Jesus. Yeah? So he just confessed, he just told us there's this actual historical person, the distinguished person who introduced their novel rights and was crucified on that account. So again, within 200 years, you have another ancient witness that Jesus was real and he was crucified. That means he died. It says they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage. It's actually right on. He's got us right. Yeah? And this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods. Now, what do they take on faith? He doesn't talk about. Fact number 3. I'm going to keep moving here, I think, and we're a little behind time. But we have Jesus was real, Jesus was crucified. These are facts that you don't have to take on faith. You take them on the witness of eyewitness accounts from the ancient world, New Testament included. This one now, you need to accept the New Testament as a document that gives you what those people actually thought. That there were real followers of this Jesus man, and they took his death very hard. So that Luke tells us that Peter, after he denies Jesus, he went out and wept bitterly. Right? That the people who thought Jesus was a Messiah did not respond well to this fact of his death. It bothered them a lot. Now that might seem like a weird thing to bring up in our list of facts, but as we keep adding other facts, that is going to make it harder to explain the whole without coming to the conclusion of the resurrection. So it's an important fact in the case. So you kind of just have to let that sit there for a second. But it's a fact. The people who followed Jesus were upset that he died. It bothered them a great deal. Now, this is where it is. Is the Bible, am I saying you have to believe that because the Bible's inerrant? No. I'm saying that the New Testament is a reliable witness of the people who were there. So that Luke, who was with Paul, who knew Peter, has it on good word that this happened. Right? And you can trust that because there's no motive to say otherwise. Why would they not tell you otherwise? In fact, if you're going to fake a religion about some guy dying and rising again and stealing his body after he dies, like you're not going to tell people that you thought he was dead and wasn't coming back. You're going to tell people he died, but we all knew it was what was supposed to happen. He told us beforehand. So it actually works against kind of the motive of lying, which is kind of important too. So fact number 4, this is the tougher one. There is less direct evidence in the sense that you have a pagan saying the tomb was empty, as there is the pagans talking about the results of the empty tomb and how everyone was trying to figure it out, and here's kind of the answer that was given. So it's not quite as newspaper science textbook-like as your average modern person would like it to be. But again, in terms of ancient world evidence, it's pretty solid stuff. That 3 days after Jesus' death, his tomb was empty. There's no two bones about it. The tomb was empty. His body was gone. How? Well, that'll come up, right? How? I don't know. But his tomb was empty. Tacitus writes, continuing from after where he said Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And he mentioned how everything bad gets to Rome eventually. So, Tacitus admits that after his death, something else happened. And it was magical sounding and bothersome. Yeah? Now, that's not like, again, a great testimony, But what's he talking about then? If there's a body in the tomb, why is a mischievous superstition taking place? Isn't the tomb right over there? Shouldn't we be able to find the body? Where's the body? The tomb's empty. Right? So you can explain the body other ways, maybe. But this is affirming for us there's an empty tomb after Jesus' death. You have Suetonius also, way back from the start, we quoted him before. He says, after the great fire at Rome, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. New and mischievous. What is the new and mischievous religious belief? That a human body can rise from the dead. It's a radical idea. It really is even for us today, but for them, nobody had ever thought of this in Greek thought. Remember, Plato teaches the spirit's good and the flesh is bad. The body's bad. So you die and you go to the good place, right? And you leave the bad behind. Why would someone teach that you come back? What a dumb idea. Yeah? They laugh at Paul when he says this at the Areopagus. But here again, we have this teaching showing up about this resurrection idea. Why? Because the tomb is empty. No reputable scholar today will be willing to say the tomb was not empty. The only ones on the History Channel are guys who are not in the mainstream of scholarship. Notice how also all of these, both of these, Tacitus and Suetonius, are too early for mythologies about Jesus' resurrection to develop. You couldn't make up a myth about somebody in 40 years. You would need hundreds of years for that to happen, right? This is right away. There's a mischievous superstition that he is a god and that he's risen from the dead. But the proof is not that he's risen from the dead here. The fact is just that there's an empty tomb. There's no body. He was died. Where'd the body go? It's a fact. Now, it is also a fact that when people say, where'd the body go? Those who are following Jesus say back, he rose from the dead. That's our answer to where the body went, right? And that's a historical fact. There are a bunch of people running around saying, I saw Jesus alive. Over 500 of them, actually, saw Jesus alive and said that. That is a fact. Not that he was alive, right? Although I believe that, right? But the fact is, people say they saw him. And you got to at least trust their word that they think they saw him, or give us a motive for why they're lying about it. Can you take the New Testament author's word about what they believed? Not if it's true, but if they believed it was true. It's a very important nuance. Josephus again confirms this fact. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Notice, he doesn't say he believes this. He's just being a historian. He's saying this is what they said, that he was alive after 3 days. Accordingly, he was perhaps, and this is a very, very, I don't believe it, perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. That is, he's saying they think he's the Messiah. They think he's the Jewish fulfillment of prophecy. Now, but here again, so you have an ancient witness who is not a Christian saying Jesus was real, Jesus was crucified, people thought he rose from the dead because there was no body in the tomb. Yeah? Now, we're going to shift gears a little bit here to keep making our case. These same people who start saying they saw Jesus alive also start worshiping on Sunday morning instead of Saturday morning. And you gotta kind of get out of yourself. Hopefully you're all here because you're Lutherans and you're like daring to be Lutheran and you really care about it. But I promise you, you don't care nearly as much about your Lutheranism as a Pharisaic Jew cared about his Judaism. Not even close. These people would live and die for it. You're like, I'm bored, I don't want to pay attention. No, that is not how they thought. They thought, God said this. Let's kill people who disagree. Right? Now, I'm not advocating that. But they cared quite a big deal about it. And nothing is at the heart of what they cared about because the temple was eventually destroyed. But the temple had been destroyed. They lost the Ark of the Covenant, so they couldn't care about that as much. Nothing was as important to them then as the other mark of the covenant, circumcision. And then with it, worship on the Sabbath. So you have this historical fact that a bunch of Jews suddenly start worshiping on a different day. And if you're going to say, I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, you've got to explain, well then why did they do that? What on earth convinced them to do this, to give it up? Especially when they say, hey, Peter, why do you worship on Sunday? Oh, well, because it's the day my Lord rose from the dead. No, that's his argument. We worship on Sunday because it's the day Jesus broke death. Yeah? It's a historical fact. Jews don't convert. They don't give up the Sabbath, but they did. Why? Add this to the other facts that we know and explain all of them together. That's what we got to challenge people to do. Also, This is happening in Jerusalem. We're not talking about a small city. We're talking about a small town by our standards. We're talking about this college campus in some senses. Maybe probably more people than that, but not a ton bigger than this, right? And so if I were to, who's a pastor I know in here? James May's in here, right? Where's James May? Okay, James May's a good guy back there. Let's say James May dies right now. He dies. Okay? Yeah. And so we go out here and we bury him in the parking lot. Dig it up a little, put him under a tree or something, right? And then tomorrow, during Matins, I run in screaming, the tomb is empty, James May is alive. You'd be an idiot not to go look at the tomb, right? You say, oh no, he's not. Oh no, he's alive. He's alive, the tomb is empty. You're going to have people going to check out the tomb. Yeah? So with that in mind, kind of the worst place in the world to fake a resurrection is a place where there's so few people. Think about it this way. So one of the arguments you're going to hear is that the disciples stole the body. Imagine trying to hide a dead body on this campus. Right? It'd be hard to do. Anybody here from a small town? How fast does word move around a small town? Pretty quick. You're in high school, right? How long does it take you to learn somebody got in trouble?
2 seconds.
Yeah, right? Even if you weren't there? Okay. Same kind of reality. Right? So the tomb being empty in Jerusalem isn't just like there's an empty tomb in New York City. No. This is a small scenario. Very few people, even though there's more there because of the Passover. And the result of this happening in Jerusalem is that the body is not presented, but the stolen body theory gets put forth by the antagonists. The Jews begin to say, the tomb is empty because he stole the body. Again, affirming the fact that the tomb is empty. And now the nail in the coffin, or the cross, you might say. You also have antagonists converting to Christianity. James, who is Jesus' biological brother via either Joseph or Mary, who before Jesus' death, we have it accounted in Mark, kind of thought Jesus was mad. Like they could see that he was going to die and they go to try to take him away. Jesus, you got to stop talking. And he's surrounded by people and he says, who are my mother and my brothers? Those who hear the word of God are my mother and my brothers. So James is not a believer. And yet, after the empty tomb, he becomes a believer because he saw Jesus rise from the dead directly. Eyewitness account. He's a smaller version of the big one, Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee of Pharisees, a man who was making his living having Christians put to death. Becomes a Christian. Not because he had a great heart-to-heart with John, and John convinced him of his sin and how he needed to repent and give his life to Jesus, but because he actually saw Jesus and was put to the point where what can I do? How can I deny this face-to-face encounter with the risen man? He's God. What am I going to do about it? Right? And that's by his own word. Why did he convert? Because he saw Jesus face-to-face. Now, you don't have to believe that he saw Jesus face-to-face, but you have to explain why he would change his mind. What on God's earth could convince this guy to become a Christian other than the resurrection of Jesus? And he becomes then the big hole in every theory that's put forward to explain these events. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, recognize that all these facts, I'll review them again in a moment, are the substance of early Christianity. I mean, there's more. There's love your neighbor as yourself, right? I mean, that's there too. But this forms the historical substance of Christianity. And the reason that Christianity is really a historical event rather than a set of ideas. It's something that can be proven wrong. If there is not a belief in Jesus' resurrection, there is no early Christianity. It never happens. So you then also, as a historian, have to explain Christianity. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what caused all these people to change their minds and believe? It's a historical anomaly. It doesn't make sense. People don't start new religions in the ancient world just left and right. Isn't something they do. It's not California. And if you're going to start a new religion, you're not going to do it in Jerusalem. Again, the last place to do this. So you have to explain Christianity. The existence of Christianity is not proof of Jesus' resurrection, but it's proof that there were people who believed in Jesus' resurrection, even when it meant abandoning their life and former faith, and even when it meant being murdered for it. Why? You, Mr. Based on Facts arguer, why? Give me an answer. They've tried to do the math, to explain how we know Jesus was a real man. He died by crucifixion. His followers took it hard. The tomb was found empty. The followers stopped dismarrying and said, why? Because they saw him. They began worshiping on that day they saw him. This happens in Jerusalem. And even later, antagonists, the enemies of the church, believe the same thing, not because they told them, but because Jesus showed up to them. And that this all forms the foundation of Christianity. Why? How do you explain all these facts? What is the reasonable explanation of history that takes into account all of these undeniable bits of archaeological, historical evidence? Ever since the rise of antagonism to Christianity, and we're talking even from the Jews then, only 3 theories have been put forward, right? So you have 3 ways of explaining all of this by historians. They are the stolen body theory, the swoon theory, and the hallucination theory. Stolen body theory. The disciples were bothered by Jesus' death, but they really kind of had gotten a taste for power. They liked how people listened to them. And so they went and they stole the body and told everybody he was risen from the dead so they could have everybody follow them now. Stolen body theory. Swoon theory. Jesus was crucified, but he didn't really die. He almost died. He passed out. He swooned, right, on the cross. So the Romans thought he was dead. They took him down. They put him in the grave. But then 3 days later, he kind of woke up and came out again and said, hey, I rose from the dead. So, swoon theory. Hallucination theory. The disciples were, this one's really stupid. It is impossible. It is literally an impossible idea. You'll still hear logical people talk about it. The disciples were so despairing. They were so distraught. They met in the upper room and they're crying. And, oh, I can't believe he's gone away. And then suddenly their emotions took over and they had a mass hallucination in which they all believed they saw Jesus. They were so in pain that they could only be comforted by believing he was there in their midst. I'm going to talk about all these in just a moment, but I want you to notice one thing that all 3 of these theories assume to be true. There's no body in the tomb. Again, historically, just every attempt to disprove the resurrection of Jesus still assumes the body's missing. So they help us, even as they try to destroy us. Every theory assumes an empty tomb. Now, some of the theories cancel each other out as well. If you're arguing with somebody in a good-natured way, you'll find that they will try to bounce between them. They'll say, well, what about this? And you're like, no, not this. Well, but then this could have been too. Yeah, well, not that. Well, then what about this? They go back to the other one. And they'll try to act as if that's building a case. To have all these ideas when they cancel each other out as arguments. You can't steal a swooned body. You can only make the case for the swooned body or for the stolen body. You can't pretend they're part of the same argument. It doesn't work that way. Logic doesn't work that way, right? You got a body that got up and left. You're like trying to steal him. He's running away. Yeah. A hallucinating group of disciples who think they saw Jesus alive aren't going to go steal the body either, right? So you still don't explain the empty tomb with that one at all. All you explain is that they thought they saw Jesus alive. And a swooned body who actually showed up in the upper room would not be a hallucination. So these 3 theories that are put forward, they have to stand on their own merit. And if you can poke a hole in any one of them, then there's a historical hole in them. I'm going to show you the hole in each one. But I want you to also know, before I do that, these holes weren't discovered by Christians trying to undermine the theories of the unbelievers. These holes were found by unbelievers who said, our theory has a hole. We need a better theory. Huh? And so these are their own undermining of the argument because they know the argument's not very good. Huh? They are weak theories. They have gaping holes, beginning with swoon theory, the science of crucifixion, death by asphyxiation. When you are crucified, you do not die because you have holes in your body that are bleeding. You die because being tied or nailed to a piece of wood with your arms in the air and your legs nailed to one spot as well, you get weak. And over time, you can't hold yourself up anymore and you begin to hang, which puts pressure on your lungs so that you cannot breathe out. It's less about the breathing in and more about the breathing out. And you'll push yourself up to be able to breathe out for a while, but eventually the pain becomes so much you can't do it. You hang there and you die by carbon dioxide poisoning. Not that you can't get oxygen in, but the carbon dioxide you can't get out poisons you and you die. That's why they break the legs of the thieves on the cross on Friday, so that they can't push themselves back up and they hang and they die faster. It's also why they're surprised that Jesus is dead, because he shouldn't have been dead yet. It was way too fast. It's kind of weird. It's almost like he just let go of his spirit on purpose, which the text says, by the way. So, when you are dead by carbon dioxide poisoning, If you are under for 12 minutes, there is no coming back. There is no resuscitation. There's no even brain dead back on the table vegetable. You're done. The poison destroys your body. So you cannot swoon on the cross for an hour and a half and just hang there while the other guys die. Right? It would not work. You'd be gone. Scientific reality. Death by crucifixion, you die. To say nothing of the heart wound, the surprise he's dead, maybe he's not dead. We're Roman soldiers. We're supposed to make sure this guy's dead. If he gets down and he's not dead, guess what happens? I'm the next one up there. Okay? So I'm going to make sure he's dead. We got a good way to do this. Let's stick a spear in his heart. Yeah? Think that'll do it? Yeah. On top of this, they have a little science. They're not stupid, ancient people. They're smarter than we are in many ways. They knew that when you die by asphyxiation, around your heart forms a pocket of clear fluid. And that if you puncture that heart right, the clear fluid will come out before any blood. And so you'll know for sure the guy's dead. He died by asphyxiation because the water came out before the blood. Kind of cool, huh? It's actually real. So they shove a spear into his heart. The guy's dead. You don't swoon by Roman crucifixions. On top of this, how does a swoon Jesus? Let's just pretend that we're going to be illogical and that he did swoon, right? How does a swoon Jesus convince his despairing followers that he's resurrected, right? So, okay, I'm going to be Jesus right now. I'm down on the ground. Okay, so I'm crawling out of the tomb, right? I got a heart wound, and I was whipped 39 times, and I got holes in my, oh, it hurts so bad. And I get to the door, and I kind of knock on the door. Hey, guys, I rose from the dead. You know? And these guys who are hiding for fear of death are going to go out and try to convince the world that you did? No, they're not. It's not a logical argument. I got to finish. Keep it. I'll try to. It'll be like 3 minutes at the end. Yeah? I want to get through all the stuff. Similar idea now. So how do you have the stolen body convince Saul of Tarsus to convert to Christianity? He's on his way to Damascus to have Christians put to death, and he sees Peter on the side of the road. He's sitting in a lazy boy chair, or like a little, what do they call those? The lawn chair kind of thing, right? And he's got like Jesus next to him, his body's next to him, his arms around him. He like lifts up Jesus' arm. Hey, Saul, I'm risen from the dead. You should follow me now, right? I mean, it doesn't work, right? Stealing the body does not convince Paul to become Paul. So if you're going to reject the resurrection, you have to explain Saul's conversion without using this theory. If you're going to reject the resurrection, you have to explain the disciples' conversions without using this theory. They don't fit. They don't work. Finally, there is no such thing as a mass hallucination. Doubly so in varying locations. So, we're in Colorado. You got a group of people go out, sit on the mountain, take some herbs and things, have a time of hallucinating together, maybe remember it as being good, but they never will have had the same hallucination. They can't share it. And on top of that, they got to take something to make what they do have happen. But there is no such thing as a joint or a shared hallucination, because hallucination by definition is inside of your head. Again, so Paul then also has this hallucination because he's so despairing as he goes to kill the Christians in Damascus. You still don't explain the antagonists, right? So again, you have all these facts and you got these theories that can explain one thing. The stolen body could explain the empty tomb, but doesn't explain conversions, right? Hallucination theory, in theory, could explain the conversions, but doesn't explain the empty tomb. So you have more facts than your theories can deal with. Again, these holes in the theories are so evident that modern anti-Christian scholars recognize them. They were the ones who pointed them out and their need for a better theory. There is a fourth theory. The problem is, it's unbelievable, right? It's not the kind of thing that happens every day. It's what we would call a miracle, which is something that's against nature. But that fourth theory that does explain every single fact that we have from the historical documents. Again, these are not Bible facts. These are historical facts, and they're all explained by what the Bible says, is the answer that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose from the dead. Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel, which is the good news, right? The good news of these facts of history, not the good news of some idea we came up with, not the good news of a mythology to give you hope, the good news of a set of facts. I would deliver to you as of first importance what was also delivered to me, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins. He didn't see that happen. Jesus told him it happened as he was risen, saying, yeah, I died for your sins, Paul. In accordance with the Scriptures, which Paul did know, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Notice how Paul, in preaching the gospel, is preaching those same set of facts, more or less, that are indisputable historically. Yeah? He says this is all Christianity really is at its root. And he points out for the Corinthians now, if you lose this, if you lose the set of facts, you lose everything. Right? If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. That is, I, Pastor Fisk, am a liar. If Jesus is dead right now and his body's somewhere in some unmarked grave, then I am leading you astray with great falsification. And all your other pastors, we're a bunch of idiots, right? We're bumbling fools, deceiving people. Preaching's in vain, and your faith is futile, for you are still in your sins. I know Americans don't really wrestle with sin much anymore, but most pagans do. I was watching Marco Polo, NC-17-ish stuff on Netflix, but it's really, really good. And they're talking about karma. And it struck me, karma is debt. I do so much over here, and I've amassed debt. I need to deal with my debt. It's going to come back and get me. I got to go do some good over here to pay off the debt. If Christ has not been raised, you're still in your debt. Even the atheist owes his creation something, and he can't get out from under it. So Paul is making the case here again, without this fact, Christianity is a waste of time. If in Christ we have hope only for this life, we are of all people to be the most pitied. So the guy who says, I can believe in the creed but not Pontius Pilate. I can believe that Jesus is a story of great hope to help people overcome their trials and troubles. That God is there to help you have your best life, say, I don't know, right now. That person is to be pitied above all people. That their thinking about Christianity isn't even Christianity. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So Paul says, if we don't have this, we have nothing, but we have this. It wasn't just delivered, it's a set of facts. And it actually explains everything that is wrong with humanity. That there was one man who came first, who was not evil, but in his arrogant desire to be God, chose to be evil, and by blood passed that on to every single one of his children and their children after them, so that the spiritual conundrum of humanity is we all want to be God. We want to be the judges of God. I won't believe in God unless you prove him to me, right? We think we're at that level. That's our problem. In this one man, Adam, our God hunger for ourselves kills us. This is the root of death. It's why our bodies decay. In Adam all die. But now, there's another man who went into that grave and walked out again. He's a new humanity. And he's got a blood that doesn't have the death in it anymore. And he wants to give it to everybody. There's no restrictions. Come, all you who are thirsty and heavy laden, I will give you rest, he says. By one man, life from the dead has come. Take and eat. Take and drink. Forgiveness of sins, resurrection, and life everlasting is yours. So as in Adam all die, in this one man Jesus, and this set of facts about him that's well nigh indisputable as facts, all are made alive. Now, does that mean you have to believe it? No. Faith comes by hearing, and you can reject that hearing. You can resist the Holy Spirit. But it is this set of facts that creates the faith. Right? I don't think we can argue unbelievers into faith, but I do believe by confessing this, unbelievers are made into believers. That's how it happens, right? It is by hearing of these eyewitness accounts. Here's Thomas. He's the skeptic, right? I won't believe unless I see. What's Jesus say to him? Blessed are those who hear about it and believe. Why? Because that's where the Spirit's working. But it's on the basis of the witnesses' accounts. God knew this. He gave us witnesses, right? He gave us people to actually see it, to touch it. Touch Jesus, to eat with him after his resurrection. So that set of facts would be there for us to this day to put our hope and our trust in. That brings us to the end of time. I want to get this guy's question before we go.
I don't have a question, I just have another hole in the theory.
Oh, okay, sure.
First of all, a swoon Jesus could not move the stone.
Theoretically, yes, unless he had help. So you could have like the swoon stolen Jesus kind of thing, like help him get out. But you're right. How is he going to do that? The swoon theory, the stolen body theory, and the hallucination theory don't make any sense. And the challenge for the atheist, I shouldn't beat up on just the atheist. The challenge for the agnostic, the person who doesn't want to make a decision, is how do you explain the history? And if you're not going to, at least don't tell me I'm an idiot for thinking it makes sense that he rose from the dead. Because I'm just looking at the facts and saying there isn't another explanation, right? You're not illogical. Go ahead.
Anti-Christians.
What
are anti-Christians?
People who don't like Christianity, who want you to believe it's not true, who want you to believe there was no Jesus, against the facts. So, all right, thank you very much for your time.